So I've had some interest in this Fireburst Ignite Elementalist from some of my friends, and I just want to share how this works, some of my gear tech choices, and I guess show some gameplay. I'm using the Fireburst from the Essence of Hysteria mod, and this lets you pop a AoE fire skill that has really high base damage and really good scaling with added effectiveness that I'm using to ignite with. I think this build sort of plays something between a auto bomber and a cold dot occultist, if you've played that before, because you can really use any skill to trigger, but then it has the sort of dot component and slow boss ticking of a cold dot occultist. And there's basically three things I'm looking for anytime I chose my league starter, which is what this was for 3.14. The first is that it has reasonable clear speed, and this definitely does. By reasonable, I mean if you're ignoring most of the mechs and doing the quick ones only, you can clear the map in easily under 2 minutes. The second thing I'm looking for is pretty consistent bossing. So I want to be able to kill Awakener 8 by around the 24-hour mark, which means I need somewhere in the range of 6k EHP, around 1 million DPS, and I need to have a playstyle for bossing that's actually consistent, right? It's really hard to boss with, say, like a double strike build unless you're really mechanically set, and I'm pretty sloppy. The third thing is that this build needs to be relatively cheap to get off the ground. So Ignite builds tend to be cheap in general, but this is particularly cheap because it doesn't even use a 6-link. The staff I'm using is purely just 6-socketed. The other part about this build that makes it pretty cheap is that the uniques that I use for the most part are looking at like 1 chaos to 20 chaos uniques. And the other thing is that transitioning to this was from Armageddon Brand Ignite, which, well, I was using Armageddon Brand on hit for a while, and then I just tagged on the Ignite after normal lab, so that was really smooth as well. I think there's a lot of good things about this build, but probably what I enjoy most about it is that it's super flexible. So you can really put in whatever skill you want to trigger it with. You can see I have a Wave of Conviction set up for single target down there, but I'm mostly just using a 1-stack Blade Vortex to trigger the Ignite. And even with the relatively low hit rate of 1-stack Vortex and almost no AoE, actually I think I have no AoE scaling at all in my tree, the clear is not terrible. And the bossing, of course, is pretty solid. I think I'm clocking around 1 to 1.5 mil effective DPS with my single damage flask of Thinner Swallow. And I'll show you after this map, I also use some other skills to trigger, so I'm a big fan of using Winter Orb, and it's super broken. So I guess I'll throw it on right here. And Winter Orb is probably not as good as Blade Vortex, but the thing is, in relatively open maps, so I'm running an estuary, Winter Orb performs better because you don't really want to be running from pack to pack clearing everything. And this brings back a lot of the sort of old school feeling of Winter Orb mapping back in on release. It's not quite as good, but you can see that it still is able to pop the Ignite, and that has to do with the Elementalist ascendancy, where any kind of damage can ignite, although I do have some Spellfire added. I also threw in my Headhunter because I guess one of the sort of next step parts of every softcore build I run is how does this build perform with a Headhunter? Like, do I actually want to play it and map with it for 1-200 maps, or will I get bored and will it feel too slow? And I think this is pretty solid with Headhunter. So it doesn't actually give you any boost to damage for the most part. Like, you do get some aura buffs that will up your damage a tiny bit, but for the most part, Headhunter is more a speed and defensive boost than anything. And you especially notice it during rituals, which have just so many freaking rares loaded into them, right? Even without a Beyond mod on this league, I'm usually hovering around 20 to 25 Headhunter stacks during these things, and I don't really look at the mods. Winter Orb's a bit clunkier in this, so if you compare it to before, I have to actually stand still to cast for maybe a quarter of a second from time to time, and that quarter of a second can get you killed even with 12k ES, or it can get you tagged by the Ruin, which is also super annoying this league. I think some other skills that have potential to trigger are Aberrath Tubes, which are the boots that sort of provide a walking simulator around you. And I saw a Herald of Thunder spec on Reddit, but I don't think that's actually really good at all, because to boss with that, would be super unreliable, and you would need to use Storm Secret. And then at that point, you're losing too many slots. You have different investments. But I'm sure there is a way to make Herald of Thunder work. Although you can see here, like, is Winter Orb really that painful compared to running a Herald of Thunder auto bomber build? I'm not super convinced. The other nice part about Winter Orb is that it's probably my selected choice for bossing. So when I do stuff like, when I get my Seer's done or I'm running many of my Maven maps, I tend to swap out the BV for Winter Orb because there's also a Culling Strike link to my Winter Orb, and that's a lot harder to proc with Blade Vortex on a boss, which is pretty much like a melee skill. The one part about Headhunter and this build though that gets a bit funky is that it doesn't really scale clear speed too much past a certain point. Because my trigger cap on Fireburst is capped at around 0.85 right now, if I'm going too fast and if I need to basically pop my Ignite more than once a second roughly, I'm gonna actually have to wait for backs. But even in here, you can see, I think I end up with something like 34 monsters left, so it's not terrible. Like, it's still a relatively clean cure, especially with Ignite Prolif. So I just want to go over some of the tech choices for my Ignite-based Fireburst Elementalist. Starting with the passive tree, it looks really generic. It's a normal-looking Ignite Elementalist passive tree with nothing special going on. I've taken the Golem nodes just because I want that ailment immunity, and this doesn't really give me any damage, and I like damage because I'm on softcore at this league. The build itself is built around this staff, so for those who don't know, level 20 Fireburst on hit comes from the Essence of Hysteria mod on a weapon. One of the really great things about this is that you don't need to actually link the sockets in your weapon for the skill gems to apply. So if you look at the skill right here, you can see that it's linked to 6 different support gems. You're really only looking for good prefixes on the staff, so I got fire dot multi and flat fire damage, which actually gives me a lot more than increased fire damage. It'd be great to get a T1% increased fire damage, but just didn't get lucky in my first essence. The head is Eye of Malice, so that bottom line is really core here. It's multiplicative regardless of the direction of the enemy's fire and cold resist. So if the enemy has, say, minus 50 fire resist, the increased fire and cold resist will take it down to minus 75 fire resist, which is a huge increase in damage, right? Malachi's Artifice is what makes that really work really well, because it's my way of applying elemental equilibrium. I'm running a lightning golem here because I want to get flat added fire, basically. And then my other ring is a Curse with Flamme on hit ring, and I'm only using this just to save sockets. So before I was using Kaum's Heart as my chest piece, but now I've moved to this rare chest piece because I needed +1 additional curse. I think better would probably be having a endurance charge on one hit or a frenzy charge on hit chest piece with a +1 curse. But this is pretty budget right here. My gloves are basically a filler slot. I have fire dot multi and spider on it. Aspect of spider is really valued here because I don't run anger. And this is just where I had an open slot. But I think the boots are pretty important to go over. Cooldown recovery rate is a really great stat with Fireburst. It has a baseline cooldown of 1 second, which isn't so bad and really doesn't make a difference when you're bossing. But as soon as you get into faster clearing maps and you're starting to really zoom through, you'll notice that some packs don't get tagged with the Fireburst Ignite, and then it can't proliferate properly. And then I have these 2 slots that are always locked out for me every league, which is Headhunter and Solstice Vigil. The Amulet slot's really flexible. I was using Namhu's Tiki for the first day, and you could go with Primordial Chain if you want to invest more in golems, but Solstice Vigil isn't that bad. I mean, it gives me damage, and the Shaper's presence actually feels really nice. And then your belt slot is another flex slot. There's a lot you could do here, but at the end of the day, Headhunter really isn't that bad because of how Dex and Strength starved this build is. You really need attributes. And then my flasks are just random ones, except for Tender Swallow. The gems are also pretty straightforward. So I guess going through the support setup is more important. Firstly, these are my 4 auras: Spider, Temp Chains, Skitterbots, and Malevolence. Really important, none of these auras add any fire-based damage to my lightning golems, like Anger, so it can still proc elemental equilibrium. There's a fix to go Supreme Ego if you're running Anger, but that's for something else. and then I'm running 4 golems. So that's the base setup here. I also have a cast when damage taken steel skin setup. And then the skill itself, so I'm supporting Fire Burst with these gems, which are all just ignite based gems. But the way I'm triggering it is really flexible, and I think this is what makes the build great. So I have a Wave of Conviction that does trigger it when I use it, and it's really important to apply exposure. But right now I'm cycling between either Blade Vortex and Winter Orb. And you can use any spell gem that you want to trigger these, but I just find that Blade Vortex and Winter Orb are the smoothest to play with. I mean, if I could play Winter Orb in its old pre-nerf release state, I totally would right now.